My husband placed the divorce settlement beside the bowl of soup I had just made, then smiled at the young mistress sitting in the very kitchen I had cared for over the past 8 years. His mother took a sip of wine and said coldly, "8 years of free room and board is more than enough for a woman like you." He did not even bother to look at me before adding, "You have no assets, no career, and nothing worth remembering." They thought they were throwing out a useless housewife. Unaware that the silent woman in front of them was holding something powerful enough to bury them all. Your presence here means more than you know. Tell me in the comments what city or country are you joining from today. Let's see how far this story has traveled. Note some elements of this story are fictional, built for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Names and settings are coincidental, but everything this story asks you to feel is worth sitting with. The alarm never woke me. I had stopped needing it years ago. By 5:45, I was already standing at the kitchen window watching Chicago pull itself out of darkness. The city in November is a particular shade of gray, not hopeless, not beautiful, just relentlessly honest. I knew the lake was out there, somewhere invisible behind the low clouds. I always knew it was there. I filled the kettle. I set the table. I ironed the shirt. These were the rhythms of my mornings, and I had learned to move through them the way a pianist moves through scales, not for the music itself, but to keep the fingers ready for something else entirely. At 6:07, while the coffee brewed and Richard's shirt hung pressed and perfect on the back of his chair, I reached into the inner pocket of my house robe and removed a phone. Not the cream-colored one on the counter, the one Richard had given me 3 Christmases ago, which I used to text him grocery lists. This was the other phone, matte black, encrypted, registered to a name that appeared on no lease, no utility bill, no marriage certificate in the state of Illinois. I opened it beneath the edge of the counter the way a student hides a novel inside a textbook. 3 notifications, 2 from Marcus, 1 from the board's overnight monitoring system. Meridian Pharma Group. Preliminary term sheet issued. Acquisition value $3.1 billion. Board sign-off required within 72 hours. $3.1 billion. I pressed my thumb to approve the preliminary notification, slid the phone back into my pocket, and turned to crack 2 eggs into the pan. Richard liked his eggs with the yolk slightly broken, not scrambled, not fully runny. Something precise in between that had taken me 4 months to perfect, and that he had never once acknowledged. Not to complain, not to praise, simply to consume the way one consumes furniture or weather. His footsteps hit the stairs at 6:22. "Morning," he said, settling into his chair without looking up from his own phone. "Good morning, Richard." He reached for his coffee, drank, reached for the newspaper. I set his plate in front of him. He did not look at it. I returned to the counter and stood with my back to him, one hand resting on the edge of the sink, eyes on the gray window. Somewhere across this city, in a tower on Michigan Avenue with my name on the 38th floor directory, a name he had never once thought to search, 17 people were already preparing for a board meeting I would chair before noon. Today, like every day for 8 years, I would be invisible. I was very good at it. I had chosen it once. I reminded myself of that every morning, especially in the silence between his coffee cup and the turning of a newspaper page. I had wanted just once to be chosen for something other than what I was worth. The kettle clicked off. I poured a second cup and did not drink it. Outside Chicago was already beginning without us. The morning Richard left for the office, the door clicked shut behind him with the same indifferent sound it made every day. Not a slam, not a gentle pull, just a click. The sound of a man who had somewhere more important to be. I stood at the sink and listened to it fade. Then I picked up the black phone and typed 3 words to Marcus approved. Move forward. $3.1 billion authorized between the eggs and the morning paper. I rinsed the pan and thought about how I had arrived here, not in this kitchen, but in this life. How a woman who had built a pharmaceutical company from a single research patent into a $6 billion enterprise had ended up ironing a shirt for a man who did not know her name. The answer was simple, and I was not ashamed of it. I had wanted to be loved. I met Richard Calloway at a charity gala on a Thursday in October 8 years and 4 months ago. I remember the Thursday specifically because I had spent 3 weeks preparing for it, not preparing the way I prepared for board presentations or Senate subcommittee hearings with data and strategy and contingency plans, preparing to be nobody. I had called my PR director Sandra and told her to remove me from the Forbes coverage cycle that year. No interviews, no list inclusion, no photographs. Sandra had paused on the line in the way she reserved for requests she found professionally alarming. "Is everything all right, Ms. Hale?" "Everything is fine," I told her. "I simply want one evening where no one knows my name." She made it happen. Sandra was exceptionally good at her job. So I arrived at the gala as Eleanor, not Eleanor Hale, chairwoman of Hale Biosciences, just Eleanor. Blue dress off the rack, no security detail, no reserved table. I stood at the bar reaching for a glass of water when a voice beside me said with quiet amusement, "You look like someone who's trying very hard not to be recognized." I laughed. Genuinely. It was the most accurate sentence anyone had aimed at me in years. Richard was charming in the way that people who are skilled at selling things are always charming. Complete attention, steady eye contact, the particular gift of making you feel like the most interesting person in a crowded room. He asked thoughtful questions. He did not check his phone. He did not Google me at the table. I thought, this is what I have been looking for. We were married 11 months later. 40 guests, no press. Before the wedding, I did the one thing my attorney had been requesting for years. I restructured everything. Hale Biosciences, founded 12 years before Richard entered my life, was placed entirely within an irrevocable trust. Every share, every patent, every subsidiary. The trust predated the marriage by a decade. Under Illinois law, no appreciation during the marriage could be claimed by a spouse. It was not a fortress I built against Richard. It was a fortress I had built long before he existed, and it would stand regardless of what happened inside the walls of this house. I told him there was some family trust business my lawyer handled periodically. He nodded and asked what was for dinner. That was the moment I should have understood something. I did not. I was in love, or what I believed was love, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes its precise opposite. We moved into Richard's house in Lincoln Park the week after the wedding. It was a beautiful house. Dark wood, high ceilings, the kind of proportions that announce a certain kind of success without shouting about it. I offered to redecorate. Richard said his mother had chosen everything and preferred it stay as it was. That was my first introduction to Vivian Calloway. She arrived on a Sunday 3 weeks into the marriage with a casserole dish and an assessment. She walked through every room with the slow deliberateness of a property inspector touching surfaces, opening cabinets, pausing at the kitchen counter where I had placed a small vase of tulips. "Richard doesn't like cut flowers," she said. "They rot." "I'll keep that in mind," I said pleasantly. She turned and looked at me for the first time with full attention. "You're not what I expected." I smiled. I hope that's a good thing. She did not answer. She set her casserole on the counter and called for Richard. What followed over the next months was a pattern so gradual I did not recognize it as a pattern at all. Vivian would make a remark about the way I folded napkins, about my cooking, about the fact that I had no career to speak of, and therefore no excuse for anything being less than perfect. Small precise delivered with the confidence of a woman who had never been contradicted in her own son's home. And Richard, to his credit, always responded. "Mother, that's not fair," he would say, placing a hand on my shoulder. Later alone, he would hold my face and say quietly, "I always take your side. You know that." I believed him completely. What I could not see, what I would only understand much later, sitting in a hotel room with evidence files spread across the bed, was that every defense Richard offered me was performed within earshot of Vivian. Every gentle correction, every mother please, was delivered precisely where she could hear it and interpret it as weakness. He was not protecting me. He was giving her permission to go further. The maid with a better apron. Vivian called me once to a neighbor, while Richard stood in the doorway behind her. He said nothing. Later that night, he told me he had handled it. I thanked him. On the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl sat a small orange pharmacy bag. Richard's vitamins, he had said when I'd asked once. A supplement his doctor recommended. I had never looked inside. I had never had any reason to. I was not in those days a woman who looked for reasons. I was a woman who believed the man standing in the doorway was on her side. I was wrong about almost everything. Vivian's Wednesday dinners were not invitations. They were summons. Every week, without exception, she arrived at 4 o'clock, walked past me in the hallway with the acknowledgement one gives a coat rack, and settled into the sitting room to wait for Richard. My role was understood without discussion. Cook, serve, clean, disappear. I had been doing it for 3 years. That particular Wednesday, I had spent 3 hours on a French onion soup, caramelizing the onions, slowly the way my mother had taught me, building the base, with patience and a splash of cognac. The house smelled extraordinary. I was quietly proud of it, which I had learned to keep to myself. Richard arrived at 6. He kissed his mother's cheek, loosened his tie, and sat down without looking at the kitchen. I brought the soup to the table. Vivienne lifted her spoon, tasted it, and set the spoon down. "It's flavorless," she announced. "What do I expect from someone who has never worked a real job in her life?" Richard chuckled softly and patted her hand. "Mother." That was all. Just mother. The way you say a word when you want credit for saying it without bearing the cost of meaning it. I returned to the kitchen. I stood at the counter and breathed. Outside the window, the Lincoln Park streetlights were coming on one by one in the early dark. I counted them. It was something I did when I needed to stay level, count things. Streetlights, cabinet handles, the number of steps between the stove and the sink. At 9:15, after Vivian had left and Richard had gone upstairs, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water. There was a faint chemical aftertaste. I noticed it the way you notice a draft present slightly wrong, not wrong enough to investigate. I attributed it to the city pipes. Chicago water had always tasted faintly of something mineral and municipal. I rinsed the glass and reached for the black phone. One message from Marcus Board needs sign-off on the Hargrove subsidiary transfer. $340 million. Tonight, if possible. I typed back, approved. I set the phone face down on the table and sat for a moment in the silence of the kitchen. The woman who had just been told her cooking was flavorless had in the space of 4 seconds authorized the movement of $340 million. Nobody in this house knew that. Nobody in this house had ever thought to ask. I finished my water, rinsed the glass a second time, and went to bed. Richard started coming home late in February. Not dramatically late, not the kind of late that announces itself with guilt or explanation. Just 30 minutes past his usual time, then 45, then an hour. The kind of late that a woman is supposed to accept without arithmetic. I accepted it. I kept his dinner warm and said nothing. Then one evening in March, he came home at 7:30 with his tie loosened and an unfamiliar energy about him, lighter somehow the way people are when they have been laughing somewhere else. He poured himself a drink, sat at the kitchen island, and said almost to himself, "Hired a new analyst this week. Sharp girl. 29. Really understands the market." I was slicing vegetables. I did not stop. "That's good," I said. "You've needed the support staff." He nodded, scrolling his phone. The conversation ended there. I have survived 29-year-olds in boardrooms for 2 decades. I have hired them, promoted them, and occasionally fired them when their ambition outpaced their judgment. The age did not alarm me. The lightness in his voice did not alarm me. I was not in those days a woman who looked for smoke. I know now what I refused to know then. Her name was Cassandra Voss. I only assembled her full portrait much later from sources I will explain in time. But the outline was this. She was beautiful in a way that required considerable maintenance, ambitious in a way that had no particular ideology behind it, and transactional in a way that she had long since stopped recognizing as a character flaw. She had done her research on Richard's wife. This much I know. She had pulled the public records, the marriage certificate, the address, the absence of any professional listing, any corporate affiliation, any digital footprint beyond a Facebook account I had not updated in 4 years. What she found was Eleanor Calloway Homemaker, Lincoln Park. To Cassandra, that meant the field was clear. What she wanted was not Richard specifically. What she wanted was the architecture around him, the client dinners, the charity galas, the business class seats, the way a certain kind of social door opens when a woman can introduce herself as the wife of someone significant. She had decided quietly and entirely on her own that the title was worth pursuing. She was not recruited. She was not manipulated. She looked at the life and she chose it. That distinction would matter later in a federal courtroom. But on that March evening, I finished slicing the vegetables plated Richard's dinner and went to bed without suspicion. The orange pharmacy bag was still on the counter. I still did not look inside. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was folding laundry. The encrypted phone buzzed twice Marcus's signal for urgent, not emergency. Emergency was 3 buzzes. I had only received 3 buzzes once in 2019, when a congressional subcommittee announced a surprise inquiry into pharmaceutical pricing and named Hale Biosciences in the preliminary brief. That had required me to be in Washington within 4 hours. This was 2 buzzes. I picked up. Eleanor. Marcus Webb had called me by my first name for 11 years. He had never once called me Mrs. Calloway. We have a problem. The Hargrove Subcommittee filed an amended brief this morning. They're including our Q3 pricing data. Legal needs you in the room. What time? 11. Michigan Avenue. I looked at the clock. It was 9:40. I looked down the hallway toward the sitting room where Vivian was watching her morning program at a volume that suggested she believed the television was in another building. "I'll be there," I said. I folded the last shirt, set it on the pile, and walked to the sitting room doorway. "Vivian, I need to go to the pharmacy. Do you need anything while I'm out?" She did not look away from the screen. "You were just at the pharmacy Thursday." I forgot something. A pause. The television murmured. "Don't be gone all day. Richard's shirts need pressing by 4. "Of course," I said. I changed in 7 minutes. Dark blazer hair up the kind of assembled that reads as professional without announcing itself. I took the black phone, my credentials card, and the small leather portfolio I kept in a box at the back of the bedroom closet behind my winter coats. The Uber dropped me on Michigan Avenue at 10:53. The building lobby recognized me before the receptionist did the biometric panel beside the executive elevator, accepted my thumbprint without hesitation. I rode to the 41st floor alone, watching the city rise beneath me through the glass. When I walked into the boardroom, the conversation stopped. 12 people around the table. Marcus at the head. 7 faces I had known for years. 4 I had hired personally, one who had just joined the board 6 weeks ago and had never seen me in person. The new board member leaned toward the person beside him and said just audibly, "Who is that?" Marcus answered from across the room without missing a beat. "That is the reason this company exists." I sat down, opened the portfolio, and chaired the meeting in 11 minutes. On the way home, I stopped at the pharmacy on Armitage and bought a box of cough syrup. Vivian never asked to see the receipt. I was back at the house by 1:30, cough syrup in hand, Richard's shirts pressed and hanging by 3:15. Vivian noticed neither. What she noticed at 3:45 was that her own prescription needed collecting. She announced this from the sitting room in the tone she reserved for instructions she expected to be carried out without discussion. "Eleanor." I appeared in the doorway. "Yes. My prescription is ready at the compounding pharmacy on Halstead. Lincoln Park. You know the one." I did not know the one. I had never been asked to go there before. "I can find it," I said. "Dr. Ostrowski called this morning. It has to be picked up before 5 or they hold it until Thursday." She turned back to her program. "You have nothing else to do." It was not a question. It was never a question. I took my coat, the car keys, and the address she had written on the back of a grocery receipt in her careful, old-fashioned cursive. Ostrowski Compounding Pharmacy, 2214 North Halstead Street. Ask for Dr. Lena. The pharmacy was narrow and quiet, tucked between a dry cleaner and a wine shop, the kind of place that existed at a remove from ordinary drugstore commerce. No cosmetics display, no greeting card aisle, just shelves of amber bottles, a compounding counter behind glass, and a small bell on the door that announced my arrival to no one visible. A woman appeared from the back, 50s white coat, reading glasses pushed up on her head. "Can I help you?" "I'm picking up for Vivian Calloway," I said. Something moved across her expression. Not suspicion exactly, but a brief recalibration the way a person looks when a name produces an internal response they choose not to voice. She turned without a word, retrieved a white paper bag from a labeled shelf, and placed it on the counter. "Sign here." I signed. I did not look at the bag's label. I had no reason to. It was Vivian's prescription. Vivian's pharmacy. Vivian's business entirely. I drove home, placed the bag on Vivian's nightstand, and told her it was there. "About time," she said. I went to the kitchen to start dinner. Later, months later, in a different life entirely, I would learn that Dr. Lena Ostrowski had kept meticulous dispensing records. Every order, every date, every name. The kind of records that when subpoenaed tell a complete story. But on that Tuesday afternoon, I drove home through Lincoln Park with the radio on, thinking about nothing more significant than what to make for dinner. Some things you only understand when you are ready to look. I was not ready yet. Dinner that evening was roast chicken with herbs from the windowsill garden I had been maintaining for 6 years without acknowledgement. Richard came home at 7 later than usual with the specific energy of a man who had received good news and was deciding how much of it to share. He sat at the kitchen island, accepted the glass of wine I poured, and leaned forward with both elbows on the counter. "Big week," he said. "Tell me," I said, turning back to the stove. "Meridian Pharma. You know the name?" I kept my eyes on the pan. "Vaguely. Drug company. Mid-size. Good pipeline. Someone is buying them big institutional buyer identity, structured through a blind trust, very clean. We're representing the seller side." He swirled his wine. $14 million in advisory fees if it closes. Biggest deal the firm has touched in 5 years. "That's wonderful, Richard." "It's more than wonderful. It's the deal that fixes everything." He said it quietly, almost to himself, the way people speak when they are reassuring an anxiety they have not admitted to anyone. Everything. I plated the chicken. I carried it to the table. I sat across from him and watched him eat with the appetite of a man who believed his problems were about to be solved. I knew the buyer. I was the buyer. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had walked me through the final structure of the Meridian acquisition, $3.1 billion acquiring party listed as a Delaware holding entity, 3 layers removed from Hale Biosciences, specifically designed so that the sell-side advisors could not identify us until the signing ceremony. Standard practice for acquisitions of this sensitivity. We did not want the price to move on rumor before the ink was dry. Richard's firm had been selected as sell-side advisor because they were competent mid-tier and unlikely to ask questions that required complicated answers. I had reviewed the selection myself. I had seen his firm's name on the document and said nothing to Marcus except, "Fine, keep the structure clean." I had not planned what came next. I want to be honest about that. I had not in that moment imagined sitting across a dinner table watching my husband celebrate a fee he would never collect. It had simply happened the way certain ironies simply happen when you have been invisible long enough. He poured himself a second glass and smiled at me across the table. "You made the chicken perfectly, Eleanor." It was, I realized, the first time in recent memory he had said something about my cooking that was not filtered through his mother. "Thank you," I said. I smiled back. Across the city, the Meridian deal moved quietly toward its conclusion, carrying $14 million in fees toward an escrow account that did not yet know what was coming. The months that followed moved the way slow damage always moves, not in dramatic ruptures, but in the accumulation of small, precise wounds that individually heal and collectively do not. I have tried since then to construct a fair accounting of that final year, not to excuse what I endured and not to inflate it, just to be accurate because accuracy was the discipline that had built everything I owned, and I saw no reason to abandon it in matters of the heart. Vivian told me on a Monday in April that I burned toast because I had nothing useful in my head. Richard, standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee, said, "Mother, please," smiling as he said it the way you smile at a child doing something mildly inappropriate that you secretly find charming. In June, she told a neighbor over the garden fence that Richard had married beneath himself, but at least the house is clean. I was weeding the flower bed 4 feet away. Neither of them acknowledged me. Richard that evening. I spoke to her about it. She won't do it again. She did it again the following Tuesday. Meanwhile, Cassandra Voss appeared with increasing frequency in the margins of my life, a name in Richard's calendar, a reference in a conversation, the faint trace of an unfamiliar fragrance on his jacket collar, one Thursday evening that I noticed, and filed away in the part of my mind I was not yet prepared to open. I was chairing Senate Subcommittee testimony on pharmaceutical pricing reform in September. I was approving a $280 million licensing agreement from a bathroom in a Chicago hotel in October, phone pressed to my ear, while Richard waited downstairs for a dinner reservation. I was running one of the most consequential pharmaceutical enterprises in the country from the pocket of a house robe, from the back seat of an Uber, from a kitchen counter, while onion soup reduced on the stove. And I was tired. Not the tiredness of overwork which I had known my entire adult life and which had always felt at its core like vitality. This was different, a heaviness that began in my bones and spread outward, a fatigue that sleep did not touch. I mentioned it once to Dr. Reeves during a routine call. She suggested iron levels and asked me to come in for a panel. I said I would schedule it when things quieted down. Things did not quiet down. Richard came home late on a Wednesday in November and said nothing about where he had been. I did not ask. We had reached the stage of a marriage where certain silences had become load-bearing, remove them, and something structural would give way. I was not ready for the floor to break. It broke anyway. The soup was a simple bisque butternut squash, a touch of cream fresh thyme from the windowsill garden. I was reducing it when I heard the front door open. 2 voices. I registered this the way you register a sound that is technically familiar but contextually wrong, the way a single wrong note in a melody you know perfectly lands in the ear before the mind has named it. I had heard Richard's key in the lock 10,000 times. I had never heard it accompanied by a woman's laugh. I did not move from the stove. The voices came closer, heels on the hardwood, confident, unhurried. Then Richard's voice, warmer than I had heard it in months. "Mother will be in the sitting room." "Perfect," said the other voice. "I've been wanting to meet her properly." They passed the kitchen doorway. Richard did not look in. The woman did briefly the way you glance at a painting you have already decided is unremarkable. She was younger than I had constructed in my imagination, prettier in a deliberate and expensive way. She was carrying an overnight bag. From the sitting room, I heard Vivienne rise from her chair. "Finally," Vivienne said, and her voice carried a warmth I had spent 8 years trying and failing to earn. "I'll finally have someone to talk to." The sound of cheeks being kissed, the sound of Vivienne laughing. I stood at the stove and watched the bisque reduce. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the envelope in his hand, turning it once, then placing it on the counter beside my hand with the precise care of someone completing an administrative task. "When you're done with that," he said, nodding at the stove, "sign those and leave them on the table." He walked back to the sitting room. I turned the burner to low. I picked up the envelope. My name was on the front. Not Eleanor Hale, not even Eleanor Calloway. Just Eleanor in Richard's handwriting like a note left for the housekeeper. I opened it. It was not divorce papers. It was a settlement agreement pre-signed by Richard and witnessed by his personal attorney. It offered me $40,000 and the removal of my name from the house deed within 72 hours. $40,000. 8 years. I set the document on the counter. I looked at the bisque. I turned off the burner. I had prepared for many things in my life. I would later tell Dr. Reeves, searching for the right words. I had not prepared for the fact that I had not prepared for this. From the sitting room, I heard laughter again. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the settlement agreement in my hand, the bisque cooling on the stove. Then I folded the document carefully, set it back in the envelope, and walked to the dining room doorway. Richard was at the head of the table. Cassandra sat to his right, her overnight bag deposited somewhere out of sight. Her posture, the relaxed confidence of a woman who had already decided this house was hers. Vivian sat across from her, animated in a way I had not seen in years, pouring wine and talking about a restaurant in River North she wanted to try. They were eating. They were eating the bisque I had made. Richard looked up. 10 minutes, Eleanor. I have a reservation at 9:30. Vivian did not look up at all. She probably needs more time to find her name. She's barely managed to find anything else in 8 years. Cassandra examined her nails. She lifted the soup spoon, tasted the bisque, and set it down. This smells strange. Can someone open a window? I walked to the counter. I picked up the pen Richard had left beside the envelope, his pen monogrammed the one I had given him for our 3rd anniversary. There's nothing legally complicated here. Richard said, his voice the measured patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. You brought nothing into this marriage. You leave with what you came with. I looked at him. Is that what you believe? It's what's true. He glanced at his watch. You have no assets, no career, no claim. The $40,000 is generous. Most judges would give you less. Vivian refilled Cassandra's wine glass. She should be grateful. 8 years of room and board is more than most people in her position could expect. Cassandra said nothing. She was looking at her phone now, the bisque forgotten. Richard leaned back in his chair. You're a decent woman, Eleanor. But you are, and I say this without cruelty, not someone who has ever brought anything remarkable to a room. He paused. Sign the agreement. Take the money. Start over somewhere quiet. I looked at the pen in my hand. I thought about the $3.1 billion term sheet I had approved from this kitchen 3 weeks ago. I thought about the board meeting I had chaired in 11 minutes from a 41st floor conference room while Vivian watched her morning program. I thought about 11 years of Marcus calling me Eleanor because he had never needed a title to know exactly who I was. I signed. I folded my apron over the back of the kitchen chair neatly, precisely the way I did everything. I picked up the small bag I had kept packed for 3 weeks, walked to the front door, and opened it. Behind me, Cassandra's voice, reservation at 9:30, still good. Richard, still good, let's go. The door closed behind me. The bisque was still warm. The Langham Hotel on Wacker Drive had a room on the 19th floor that looked directly east toward the lake. I had stayed there once before 7 years ago for a pharmaceutical conference I had attended as a keynote speaker under my professional name. The front desk manager had not recognized me when I checked in last night. I had given my name as Eleanor Hayes, my mother's maiden name, paid cash for 3 nights, and taken the elevator without speaking to anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed until 2 in the morning. The settlement agreement on the nightstand, the city lights reflected on the ceiling in slow, indifferent patterns. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because crying would have been weakness, but because what I felt was not grief in any form I recognized. It was something more architectural. The sensation of a load-bearing wall discovered too late to have been hollow all along. At 6 a.m., I picked up the black phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. I know, he said, before I spoke a word. How Patricia called me at midnight. She's been watching his accounts for 6 months, Eleanor, on her own initiative. She didn't tell you because she didn't want to be wrong. I was quiet for a moment. Patricia Osei had been my general counsel for 9 years. She was the most precise human being I had ever employed and the most privately loyal. The idea that she had been building a case in silence, waiting to be wrong, landed somewhere in my chest with a weight I could not immediately name. Where is she now? I asked. Downstairs, Marcus said. We're both downstairs. We thought you might want breakfast. They were at a corner table in the hotel restaurant when I arrived, Marcus in his customary dark suit. Patricia, with a leather portfolio already open beside her coffee cup, 3 manila folders stacked with the particular neatness of someone who had been organizing her thoughts all night. Patricia looked at me steadily. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Tell me everything now, I said, and sat down. Over the next 40 minutes, she laid out what she had found irregular patterns in Richard's trading accounts, expense reports that did not reconcile corporate card charges from locations that did not match his stated schedule, and most significantly, an anonymous tip filed with the SEC 6 months ago by someone inside Callaway Capital itself. The FBI and SEC already have an open preliminary investigation, Patricia said. Whatever we bring them will be supplemental. The foundation is already there. I poured my coffee. Then we build on it, I said. Open 4 parallel investigations: tax records, trading activity, corporate loans. I paused. And pharmacy receipts. Patricia wrote it down without asking why. She would understand soon enough. One additional note, Patricia said before closing her portfolio. The settlement agreement signed under duress with witnesses who participated in the coercion. We are not invoking it. We are not bound by it. I simply want you to know it will not be used against you. Patricia's first report reached me 4 days later. Richard and Cassandra had moved into a 48th floor penthouse in Streeterville, north-facing, floor-to-ceiling, glass unobstructed views of Lake Michigan that cost, according to the lease agreement Patricia had obtained through a licensed private investigator retained under her authorization, $28,000 per month. I read that figure twice, not because it surprised me, but because I wanted to hold it accurately in my mind. $28,000 per month. For a man whose firm had been quietly hemorrhaging senior advisors for 18 months and whose trading accounts showed a pattern of increasingly desperate position reversals. Marcus sat across from me in my office on the 38th floor and watched me read. When I set the report down, he said carefully, "There's more." There was more. In the first 7 days following the move, a dinner for 2 at a 3 Michelin-star restaurant on the Gold Coast, $4,200 charged to a Callaway Capital corporate card under Client Entertainment. A private charter to Miami for a long weekend, $18,000, same card categorized as business development. A Hermes Birkin bag, Kelly Green, $22,000 personal card. A Patek Philippe Nautilus, $87,000 split across 2 cards. The Patek was purchased at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, Marcus said. He had a client call scheduled at 11. Did he take it? He rescheduled. I set down my coffee. And Vivian, $6,000 a month from his operating account. Direct transfer first of the month. He's already 2 weeks late on October's payment. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the lake. From up here, the water was gray-blue and enormous, the kind of view that makes human problems feel appropriately scaled. Richard had waited 8 years for this life, the penthouse, the younger woman, the Patek on his wrist at 11 in the morning. He had built his exit strategy around a $14 million advisory fee that was, in fact, mine to give or withhold. How long does he have? I asked. Marcus did the arithmetic without hesitation. He had already done it. At this burn rate, his personal accounts are depleted in approximately 9 months. The firm's operating capital runs out sooner, 6 months, possibly 5, if the margin calls accelerate. And the meridian fee closes in 11 weeks. He thinks that saves him. He thinks that saves everything, Marcus said. I picked up the report again and turned to the second page. Then, I said quietly. We make sure he believes that right up until the moment it doesn't. Marcus said nothing. He did not need to. Outside, the lake moved with the slow indifference of something that had been there long before any of us and would be there long after. What I'm about to tell you next took me a long time to say out loud. Before I reveal the truth that changed everything, drop the word "ready" in the comments so I know you're still here with me. A gentle note, this story contains some fictional elements reconstructed for the purpose of deeper storytelling and reflection. If that's not the journey you came here for, this is a perfectly good place to stop no judgment at all. Dr. Naomi Reeves called on a Thursday morning at 10:47. I was in the office reviewing the second tranche of Patricia's investigation files when the personal line rang, not the corporate line, not the encrypted board channel, but the small private number I gave to fewer than 6 people in the world. Naomi was one of them. "Eleanor," she said, "are you somewhere you can talk?" Something in her voice made me close the file. "Yes. What is it?" "I have your blood panel results. The full comparative analysis, 5 years of stored samples cross-referenced." A pause. The kind of pause a doctor takes when she is choosing words with the care of someone who knows they cannot be unchosen. "I need you to come in." "Tell me now, Naomi." Another pause, shorter this time. She had known me long enough to understand that I did not ask twice. The panels show a consistent presence of a synthetic progesterone antagonist, a hormone-blocking compound, low dose, administered regularly over an extended period. Her voice was steady, clinical, but underneath it, something else entirely. Eleanor, this compound is not something that occurs naturally, and it is not something available in standard pharmacies. It comes from specialty compounding facilities. Someone has been putting this in something you consume regularly. The office was very quiet. I was aware of the city outside the window. I was aware of the file on my desk. I was aware of my own breathing, which had become, without my deciding it, extremely controlled. "How long?" I asked. "Based on the progression across the 5 samples at minimum 4 years, possibly from as early as the 3rd month of your marriage." The 3rd month of my marriage. I sat with that for a moment. The arithmetic arrived without invitation. 8 years married, 4 years of documented exposure, beginning at month 3. The miscarriage in year 2. The specialist appointments. The diagnosis of unexplained infertility delivered by a physician who'd been thorough and compassionate, and entirely without the information he would have needed to find the real answer. "Unexplained." "Eleanor," Naomi said quietly, "are you still there?" "I'm here." "I want you to come in today. The samples are stored under forensic-grade cold chain, your standing instruction from year 1. They are fully admissible. But I need you in front of me before we talk about next steps." "I'll be there at 2, I said. I set the phone down. I looked at the file on my desk, Richard's trading records, his expense reports, his carefully constructed architecture of fraud. All of it suddenly rearranged itself in my mind into a different shape entirely. He had not simply stopped loving me. He had been 1 milligram at a time for 4 years, making certain there would be nothing left to love. I did not go directly to Naomi's office. I drove to the lake first. I parked on Lakeshore Drive at the Fullerton Avenue overlook and sat with the engine off and the November wind pressing against the windows with a sound like distant argument. The water was the color of pewter. A single cargo ship moved along the horizon with the slow patience of something that had no opinion about the weather. I sat for 2 hours. I am not certain I thought about anything specific during those 2 hours. I am certain I did not cry. What happened was more interior than that. A slow, silent rearranging of everything I believed I understood about the last 8 years, like a room being methodically dismantled and examined piece by piece under a different light. The miscarriage had been in March of year 2. I had been 11 weeks along. I remember the specialist, a kind man, careful with his words, who had held my file and said, "Sometimes these things have no explanation. Your body is healthy. There is no reason this should happen again." No reason. No reason he could see because no one had told him what to look for. I thought about the herbal tea. The blend Vivian had recommended in the first months of the marriage. "It will help you sleep, Eleanor. You always look exhausted," which I had drunk every morning for years because I was a woman trying to belong in a house that did not want her, and small gestures of acceptance from Vivian felt in those early days like oxygen. The orange pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter, Richard's vitamins. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and looked at the cargo ship until it disappeared. Then I started the car and drove to Naomi's office. She was waiting for me. She did not speak when I walked in. She simply placed a chair beside her desk rather than across from it, a small gesture that meant more than she probably knew, and sat with me while I read the full panel report. When I finished, I set it down. "I want this documented," I said. "Every sample, every result, chain of custody fully preserved." "Already done," she said. "And I need the name of the compound, exactly, with the manufacturing source." "It matches a formulation available only from specialty compounding pharmacies." She paused. "The kind that keep detailed dispensing records." I stood. I straightened my coat. "Naomi," I said, "add a 5th investigation to Patricia's list, criminal spousal poisoning. Illinois 720 ILCS 5/12-3.05, aggravated battery." She looked at me for a long moment. "Eleanor, are you all right?" I picked up my bag. "I will be," I said. "I just needed to know what I was building a case against." I walked out into the November afternoon and called Patricia. Patricia called me the following Monday morning with the particular cadence she used when something significant had arrived unexpectedly. "We have a contact," she said. "Someone from inside Callaway Capital reached out through a blind channel. He wants to talk." I set down my coffee. "Who?" "Daniel Mercer, their CFO." I knew the name. I had reviewed Callaway Capital's public filings enough times in the past weeks to have memorized the executive roster. Daniel Mercer, CFO, 11 years with the firm, quiet professional record, no public controversies. The kind of man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he had been handed the shovel often enough to understand the geography. "What does he want?" I asked. "Protection," Patricia said. "He's invoking the SEC whistleblower program, Dodd-Frank Section 21F. He wants formal confirmation that his identity will be shielded before he gives us anything. Can we guarantee that—" "We don't need to. The SEC already can. He filed the preliminary whistleblower form 6 months ago. That's the anonymous tip that opened the original investigation. He's been waiting for the right moment to go further." A pause. Apparently, our parallel investigation gave him confidence that the moment had arrived. I thought about Daniel Mercer sitting inside Callaway Capital for 11 years, watching Richard construct his architecture of fraud, from the inside carrying that knowledge the way people carry things they cannot put down and cannot speak about, carefully, exhaustingly, in silence. "Set the meeting," I said. "Patricia only. No names on my side until he's committed." The meeting happened 2 days later in a conference room at the SEC's Chicago field office on South Dearborn Neutral Ground. Federal oversight, everything recorded with Mercer's full consent. Patricia called me immediately after. "Eleanor," she said, and her voice had the quality of controlled excitement she reserved for evidence that exceeded expectations. "He brought the email chain." "Tell me." Richard received material non-public information from a board member of a pharmaceutical company, a company called Vantage Biotech, 3 days before placing a $4.2 million options trade. The trade returned 340% in 11 days. She paused to let the number land. Mercer has the internal communications showing Richard received the information, discussed it with Cassandra Voss, and structured the trade to avoid single-account reporting thresholds. Cassandra knew. Cassandra helped structure it. She's on 2 of the emails. I walked to the window and looked out at Michigan Avenue. $23 million in illegal trading profit built on information stolen from an industry I had spent my career building. An industry Richard had treated as a resource to be mined from the pocket of a woman he considered furniture. "Tell Mercer," I said quietly, "that his cooperation is noted and will be reflected in everything that follows." "He'll be relieved to hear it," Patricia said. "Good," I said. "Now let's give him something worth cooperating for." I want to be precise about Cassandra Voss because imprecision would be a disservice to the truth. It would be convenient, emotionally satisfying in a particular way that stories sometimes allow themselves to be, to cast her as a victim of Richard's manipulation. A young woman drawn in by an older man's charm, gradually implicated in things she did not fully understand, ultimately swept up in consequences she never intended. That is not who Cassandra Voss was. I know this because Patricia's investigation combined with Mercer's testimony and the digital forensics that followed assembled a portrait detailed enough to be definitive. I am narrating it here as I later pieced it together, not as I knew it in the moment, but as the evidence eventually made clear. Cassandra had identified Richard as a target 8 months before she joined Callaway Capital. She had found him through a professional networking event, researched his firm, noted his profile successful enough to provide access, not prominent enough to attract serious scrutiny, and applied for a position as a financial analyst with a resume that was, Patricia noted, was something approaching admiration, immaculately constructed. She had then researched his wife, Eleanor Callaway. The public record said, homemaker, Lincoln Park address, no corporate affiliations, no professional listings, no digital footprint of consequence. To Cassandra, this was confirmation. The wife was nobody. The position was available. The title wife of a prominent Chicago finance executive carried with it a social architecture she had been calculating the value of for years. Charity galas, board introductions, the particular doors that open when a woman can say, "My husband's firm," at the right dinner table. She was not in love with Richard. I do not believe she was capable of the specific vulnerability that love requires. What she felt for him was the satisfaction of a strategy executing correctly, and she was not innocent of what she was walking into. By the time she helped Richard structure the first shell company transfer, a Delaware LLC registered in her name as agent, through which $11 million in laundered advisory fees would eventually pass, she understood precisely what the entity was for. Mercer's emails confirmed she had asked specific questions about the transfer mechanics. She had not been handed a document and told to sign. She had sat in a conference room and asked how it worked. She was a co-conspirator by choice, not by coercion, not by naivety. I tell you this, not with anger. I had moved past anger by the time I understood her fully, but with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 8 years being underestimated and had learned through that experience to see other people with uncomfortable precision. Cassandra had looked at my life and seen in vacancy. She had been wrong about almost everything, especially about what the vacancy contained. Patricia arrived at my office on a Wednesday afternoon with 4 folders and the expression of a woman who had not slept adequately in several days, but was too professionally satisfied to care. She set the folders on my desk in a precise row left to right and sat down. "The money laundering structure," she said, opening the first folder. $47 million over 4 years. 4 entities, 3 Delaware LLCs and 1 Wyoming holding company. Layered transfers, each one designed to move the origin point 1 step further from Richard's name. I looked at the organizational chart she had prepared. It was elegant in the way that well-constructed fraud is sometimes elegant, each layer, serving a specific purpose, each entity providing just enough legitimate activity to justify its existence on paper. "Where did the money originate?" I asked. "2 sources." She opened the second folder. "First, inflated advisory fees. Callaway Capital billed clients for services that were never rendered. The invoices are detailed professional, completely fabricated. 11 clients over 4 years, average overcharge of $2.3 million per client. Did the clients know? 3 have already filed complaints with FINRA. They assumed it was billing error. None of them connected it to a pattern." She paused. "They will now." And the second source, systematic siphoning of Callaway Capital's own operating account. Small transfers, never more than $40,000 in a single transaction routed through a payroll processing intermediary and then into the first LLC layer. Patricia turned a page. Mercer identified 27 separate transactions over 18 months. He flagged them internally twice. Both flags were overridden by Richard personally. I looked at the transfer records. 27 transactions, each one small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, each one contributing to a structure that had moved $47 million through 4 shell companies and into accounts that Patricia had now traced to a private banking arrangement in the Cayman Islands. "Cassandra," I said, it was not a question. "Registered agent on 2 of the 4 entities," Patricia confirmed. "The Delaware LLCs, the ones that received the largest transfers. Her signature is on the formation documents. Her personal email address is listed as the contact for the registered agent service. She signed knowing what they were." Mercer confirms she attended the structuring meeting for both entities. She asked about reporting requirements. Patricia closed the folder. She was not a passive participant. I sat back in my chair and looked at the organizational chart. $47 million moved with patience and precision over 4 years, while I had cooked dinner and ironed shirts and drunk herbal tea laced with compounds I did not know were there. "Add this to the federal dossier," I said. "Already drafted," Patricia said. "There is 1 more file." She placed the 4th folder on top of the others. "The bank fraud," she said. "This one is the largest." Patricia opened the 4th folder and placed a single document on top of the stack. It was a loan agreement. $60 million issued by a consortium of 3 Chicago-area commercial banks dated 14 months ago. The borrower, Callaway Capital Management, LLC. The stated purpose, expansion capital for the formation of Callaway Capital Private Equity Division. Does this division exist? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. It does not, Patricia said. There is no office, no staff, no fund structure, no regulatory filings with the SEC for a new investment vehicle. The division was announced internally in a memo Richard sent to his team, referenced in the loan application, and never mentioned again. I turned the page. The financial statements attached to the loan application were thorough, audited, stamped, signed, carrying the letterhead of an accounting firm called Merritt and Associates. Who are Merritt and Associates? I asked. Patricia allowed herself a brief, precise smile. A 4-person accounting firm incorporated in Illinois 13 months ago. Richard owns 40% through a nominee, a former college roommate with no accounting credentials who is listed as managing partner. She paused. The audit was, in essence, Richard certifying his own financial statements. $60 million borrowed on the strength of financial statements that Richard had effectively written himself through an auditing firm he effectively owned for a business division that did not exist. The money had flowed into Callaway Capital's operating accounts, and from there into the same layered structure Patricia had mapped the previous hour. The banks, I said, do they know? 2 of the 3 have retained outside counsel in the past 6 weeks. They have noticed the irregularities but have not yet filed formal complaints. They are, I suspect, hoping to recover quietly. Patricia closed the folder. They will not recover quietly. I stood and walked to the window. The lake was visible from here on clear days, a strip of blue-gray between the buildings present and indifferent. Patricia, I said without turning, the biotech positions, the ones that lost money, which companies? I heard her open a separate file. Vantage Biotech and Meridian Sciences both dropped significantly after Richard took long positions. Vantage Biotech is on our acquisition watch list from 18 months ago, I said. Meridian Sciences, we ruled them out in Q2 of last year. The decision was made in a call I took from the kitchen. The silence behind me lasted 3 full seconds. He was listening to your calls, Patricia said quietly. He was mining everything I had, I said, while treating me as if I had nothing. I turned from the window. Add the biotech overlap to the SEC filing. 2 additional counts. Patricia wrote it down without a word. The architecture of what Richard had built was now fully visible. $60 million in bank fraud, $47 million laundered, $23 million in illegal trades, $12 million in unpaid taxes. All of it constructed around a woman whose value he had never once thought to calculate. 3 weeks after the bank fraud file landed on my desk, Patricia walked into my office, carrying a single manila folder, set it in front of me, and sat down without preamble. That's everything, she said. I looked at the folder. It was not thick, perhaps 40 pages tabbed and indexed, with the precision Patricia applied to everything she considered definitive. The kind of document that does not need to be large to be devastating. I opened it. The summary page listed 5 charges in clean numbered sequence. Federal tax evasion, $12 million, 6 years. Insider trading, $23 million, 5 years. Money laundering, $47 million, 4 years. Bank fraud, $60 million. Criminal spousal poisoning, 4 years of documented exposure, forensic samples, preserved purchase records traced. Total financial fraud, $142 million. I read every page. I read the supporting exhibits. I read the chain of custody documentation for Naomi's blood samples. I read Mercer's email transcripts. I read the dispensing logs from Dr. Ostrowski's pharmacy, cross-referenced against Vivian's personal banking records. When I finished, I closed the folder and set it on the desk between us. Is this enough for a federal conviction? I asked. Patricia did not hesitate. On any single charge, yes. On the tax evasion alone, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division would move. On the insider trading, the SEC has precedent for significantly larger sentences than what the dollar amount suggests because of the pharmaceutical sector classification. She paused. Together with the poisoning charge added under Illinois state law, he is looking at a minimum of 10 years federal, likely more depending on the judge. And Cassandra, co-defendant on the laundering and the securities fraud. Her cooperation, if offered, would reduce her exposure significantly, but that is her attorney's calculation to make, not ours. And Vivian, Patricia's expression did not change. Aggravated battery conspiracy. Class 2, felony under Illinois 720, ILCS 5/12-3.05. 3 to 7 years, potentially concurrent with asset forfeiture proceedings on the funds traceable to Richard's laundered accounts. I sat with that for a moment. Vivian, who had called me a maid with a better apron. Vivian, who had kissed Cassandra on both cheeks and said finally. Vivian, who had driven to a compounding pharmacy in Lincoln Park and purchased a hormone-blocking compound and put it in my morning tea for 4 years. Then we wait for the right moment, I said. Do you have a moment in mind? I closed the folder. The Meridian closing ceremony. Richard will be in the room. Cassandra will be in the room. 340 guests press credentials, federal agents already mid-investigation. I looked at Patricia. We give them the folder. We let the room do the rest. Patricia picked up her pen. I'll coordinate with Agent Briggs. Do that, I said. And Patricia, thank you for watching when I couldn't. She looked at me for a moment with something that was not quite sentiment but was adjacent to it. It's what I'm here for, she said. She picked up the folder and walked out. I turned back to the window and looked at the lake for a long time. The subpoena for Ostrowski Compounding Pharmacy's dispensing records was filed on a Thursday and honored by Friday afternoon. Patricia brought the response to my office in a sealed evidence envelope, which she opened with the deliberate care of someone who understood that what was inside had crossed from the domain of investigation into the domain of proof. She laid 3 documents on my desk. The first was a dispensing log, 14 pages, single-spaced, covering 4 years of orders from the Lincoln Park Pharmacy. Dr. Lena Ostrowski, it turned out, kept records of a precision that would have satisfied any federal auditor. Every compound listed by formulation, every order dated, every client name recorded in full. Patricia placed her finger on a highlighted entry near the top of page 2. Callaway Vivian M compound, progesterone antagonist. Blend, P7. Dosage 2 milligrams. Frequency, monthly refill. Payment, personal check, Vivian M. Callaway. First order date, 11 weeks after Eleanor and Richard Callaway's marriage certificate was filed with Cook County. The orders continued without interruption for 4 years and 1 month. They stopped 2 weeks before Richard handed me the settlement agreement. I looked at that stop date for a long moment. He had known at least 2 weeks before that Tuesday evening that he was done. The compound was no longer necessary. Whatever it had been intended to prevent had been prevented long enough. The second document, Patricia said quietly. It was a bank statement Vivian Callaway's personal checking account subpoenaed as part of the parallel financial investigation. Each monthly pharmacy payment was visible small amounts, consistent, unremarkable, in isolation. The kind of transaction that disappears inside ordinary household expenses unless you know what you are looking for. And the third, Patricia said, this was the one she had saved. 12 text messages recovered from a forensic copy of Richard's work phone, obtained via the SEC subpoena. The messages were between Richard and Vivian spanning 3 years. Patricia had printed them in chronological order. I read them slowly. Most were mundane scheduling logistics, the ordinary texture of a son and mother in regular contact, but threaded through them in language that was careful without being careful enough was the architecture of what they had done. Month 4, Richard to Vivian. Is the new blend working? She mentioned fatigue to her sister. Vivian to Richard. Dr. O adjusted the dosage. Should be more effective now. 2 years later, Vivian to Richard. She still doesn't suspect. I put it in the herbal blend she drinks every morning. She thanked me for recommending it. I set the messages down. The herbal tea. The blend Vivian had pressed into my hands in the 3rd month of our marriage with a warmth she had never shown me before or since. "It will help you sleep, Eleanor. You always look exhausted." I had thanked her. I had drunk it every morning for 4 years. "Vivian's charge," I said when I could speak with the necessary steadiness. "Aggravated battery conspiracy. Make certain Agent Briggs has these texts before anything else." "Already sent," Patricia said. She gathered the documents, carefully returned them to the evidence envelope, and sealed it. Outside Chicago moved through its afternoon without knowing what had just been confirmed in a 38th floor office overlooking the lake. The evidence envelope had been with Agent Briggs for 48 hours when Marcus appeared in my office doorway on a Monday morning with the particular expression he wore when he had done something on his own initiative that he was reasonably confident I would approve of, but wanted to disclose before I discovered it independently. I had learned to recognize that expression over 11 years. "What did you do?" I asked. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, and said, "I called James Whitfield." I looked at him. James Whitfield had been covering pharmaceutical regulation for the Chicago Tribune for 20 years. He was 57, meticulous, professionally stubborn in the way that the best investigative journalists are stubborn, not combative, simply immovable once he had decided something was true and important. He and I had known each other since 2004 when he had covered a congressional hearing at which I had testified about generic drug pricing. We had maintained a careful, respectful, professional distance ever since, the kind of relationship that functions precisely because both parties understand its boundaries. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing about you," Marcus said immediately. "Nothing about the full scope. I gave him one document, an anonymous tip about a mid-size Chicago investment firm currently under SEC preliminary review for insider trading activity in the pharmaceutical sector." He paused. "Public information, essentially. The SEC docket is accessible if you know what to search for. I simply gave him a more precise search term." "He doesn't know the source." "He doesn't know the source, he doesn't know your name, and he won't until you choose to tell him." Marcus folded his hands. "But he has started pulling records. I spoke to his editor's assistant this morning. 3 public records requests filed with FINRA in the past 72 hours, all related to Callaway Capital." I considered this for a moment. Patricia had been explicit in her guidance Eleanor's direct involvement in media outreach prior to federal charges being filed carried defamation exposure that was not worth the risk. The evidence had to speak before Eleanor did. The journalist's involvement needed to be procedurally separated from anything that could be traced back to me as a source. Marcus had understood this without being told. "When Whitfield publishes," I said, "he publishes on his own investigation. His sources are public records and his own reporting." "Correct," Marcus said. "You are not a source. You have never spoken to him about this matter. And he will be at the closing ceremony. I've requested press credentials for the Tribune's pharmaceutical correspondent." A pause. "Whitfield covers pharmaceutical regulation. He qualifies." I nodded slowly. The pieces were assembling themselves with a precision that felt, at moments like this one, almost architectural, each element placed where it needed to be, each support beam carrying exactly its share of the weight. "Good," I said. "Make sure his credentials are confirmed. I want him in that room." Marcus stood. "Consider it done." He walked to the door, then stopped. "Eleanor, he's going to win a Pulitzer for this story." "I know," I said. "He deserves it." Patricia's financial surveillance reports arrived on my desk every Friday. I had developed a ritual around them: coffee, the window, the lake visible on clear days, the reports read in sequence from least to most significant. It was a discipline I had learned in the early years of building Hale Biosciences, when bad news arrived regularly, and the only productive response was to receive it without flinching and then decide what to do next. The month 4 report arrived on a Friday in late November. I poured the coffee, sat by the window, and read. The Bentley Bentayga had been delivered on a Tuesday, $287,000, financed at 80%, through a luxury auto lender, the monthly payment drawn from Callaway Capital's operating account under the category Executive Transportation. The same week, a consignment of Italian bespoke furniture arrived at the Streeterville penthouse. $340,000. Corporate card. Category office furnishings. I set down my coffee. The penthouse itself was costing $28,000 per month. The Bentley payment was $4,200. The furniture had been charged in a single transaction that would trigger an automatic review flag from any competent corporate auditor, which, given that the firm's auditing arrangement was the one Patricia had dismantled in the bank fraud file, meant no flag had been raised at all. I kept reading. In the second month, Richard and Cassandra had taken a 10-day trip to the Maldives, an overwater villa at a resort whose daily rate was $8,500. Total cost $85,000 charged to a personal card that was drawing from the same operating account through a cash advance mechanism that Mercer had flagged internally and been overridden on. By month 3, the margin calls had begun. Patricia's surveillance had captured 3 separate calls from Richard's prime brokerage, each requesting additional collateral against leveraged positions that were moving against him. He had liquidated 2 long-term equity positions at a combined loss of $900,000 to meet the first 2 calls. The third remained outstanding. Meanwhile, 3 senior advisors had resigned from Callaway Capital in a 6-week period. Their departure letters obtained through Mercer cited concerns about the firm's strategic direction. I turned to the final page of the report. Patricia had appended a single handwritten note at the bottom, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who editorialized in official documents. It read, "He told Cassandra this week per intercepted personal email. Meridian closes in 8 weeks. After that, everything resets." She responded, "It had better. I've been patient." I folded the report and set it on the desk. Patient Cassandra had written. I thought about patience, what it actually cost, how long it actually took, what it actually built. 8 weeks until Meridian closed. I had been patient for 8 years. The forensic team Patricia had retained found it on a Wednesday buried in a personal email account Richard had used for correspondence he preferred to keep separate from his professional server. It was dated 26 months ago. 2 years and 2 months before the Tuesday evening, he had placed a settlement agreement beside my hand on the kitchen counter. He had written it to his personal attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, whose own correspondence had been swept up in the SEC subpoena, and now sat in Patricia's evidence files with the quiet patience of things that have been waiting to be found. Patricia read it to me over the phone because she felt, and I agreed with her assessment, that I should hear it before I read it. Her family has some kind of inheritance, Richard had written. Probably a few million, nothing significant. Some trust her father set up years ago. Even if she had more, the prenup she never mentioned protects her side, not mine. My exit strategy is clean. Timeline depends on the Meridian close assuming Q4 next year. Let me know if the settlement framework needs adjusting before then. Patricia stopped reading. I was standing at the window. The lake was flat and gray and very still. He knew about the trust, I said. He knew a trust existed, Patricia said carefully. He did not know what was in it. He assessed the risk and decided it was not worth investigating further. He was wrong by approximately $6 billion. Yes, Patricia said. He was. I stayed at the window for a moment longer, turning the email over in my mind the way you turn a found object examining each surface. What struck me was not the betrayal. I had been living inside the evidence of that for weeks, and it had ceased to surprise me. What struck me was the texture of his dismissal. He had not investigated me out of malice. He had not made a calculated decision to underestimate me. He had simply looked at Eleanor Callaway homemaker Lincoln Park and concluded she was not worth the time it would take to look more carefully. Lazy arrogance, the most expensive kind. He had been planning his exit for at least 2 years, while I had ironed his shirts and reduced his sauces and drunk the herbal tea his mother had laced with compounds designed to ensure I would never give him an heir he might then have had legal reason to remain for. The architecture of it, fully assembled, was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Almost. Patricia, I said. Add the email to the dossier. Flag it for the sentencing phase. Already done, she said. Eleanor, are you all right? I thought about the question honestly. I am the most all right I have been in 8 years, I said. I simply needed to understand the full dimensions of the room I was standing in. I ended the call and stood at the window until the lake changed color with the shifting afternoon light. He had been wrong about almost everything. Most of all, he had been wrong about what nothing looks like. The formal return was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. Marcus had arranged it with the precise understatement he applied to everything he considered historically significant, a standard board meeting notice agenda, items listed in ordinary sequence. No language that would indicate to anyone outside the room that what was happening was anything other than routine governance. I dressed carefully that morning, not with the deliberateness of performance, but with the quiet attention of a person returning to something that had always belonged to them. Dark charcoal suit, the one I had worn to the Senate subcommittee hearing in 2019. Hair up. The small platinum watch my mother had given me the year Hale Biosciences filed its first patent. The building on Michigan Avenue recognized me before anyone inside it did. The lobby biometric panel, the elevator, the 42nd floor reception area, each system responding to credentials that had never been suspended, never been altered, never been anything other than fully active. I had simply not used them from this entrance in 8 years. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan on 3 sides. 17 board members were seated when I walked in. They stood. Not as a choreographed gesture, it happened the way things happen when they are instinctive, rather than planned a movement that rippled from one end of the table to the other in the space of 2 seconds. And then the room was quiet, with a particular quality of quiet that follows something that does not require comment. I took my seat at the head of the table. "Thank you," I said. "Sit down. We have work to do." The agenda had 3 items. First, final board approval for the Meridian Pharma acquisition valued at $3.1 billion, structured through the blind trust vehicle Patricia's team had maintained throughout the negotiation. The vote was unanimous. It took 4 minutes. Second, authorization of a $50 million endowment for a new research initiative focused on reproductive health, specifically the investigation of hormone-disrupting compounds and their long-term effects on fertility. The fund's existence was not yet public. The board approved it without detailed discussion, trusting, as they had always trusted, that I did not bring items to this table without sufficient reason. I did not explain my reason, not yet. Third, selection of the closing ceremony venue for the Meridian acquisition. The recommendation from Marcus was the Grand Ballroom of the Intercontinental Chicago capacity, 340 press credentials, available appropriate for a transaction of this significance. Date, asked the board member to my left. 6 weeks from today, Marcus said. The date was confirmed. I looked around the table at 17 people who had waited with varying degrees of patience and unwavering professional loyalty for this morning. One additional note, I said before closing the meeting. The sell-side advisor on the Meridian transaction is Callaway Capital Management. Their representative will be at the closing ceremony. A brief silence. Marcus looked at me steadily. He knew. "I want him in that room," I said simply. "Make sure the invitation is personally addressed." The old cell phone rang on a Thursday evening at 6:43. I had kept it active deliberately, the cream-colored phone Richard had given me 3 Christmases ago, the one I had used for grocery lists and Sunday calls to my sister. I had ported it to a new carrier the morning after I checked into the Langham, changed the billing address, and set it to forward all incoming calls to a monitored line Patricia's team could access. It was in the language of the investigation, a passive surveillance instrument. In practical terms, it was a phone I carried in my coat pocket and waited for. It rang on a Thursday evening, and the number was Vivian's. I let it ring twice before answering. Eleanor. Her voice was different from how I remembered it, smaller somehow, as if the dimensions of the room she was calling from had contracted around her. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "Vivienne," I said. A pause. "Richard's allowance is 2 weeks late. I've called his office 3 times, and they keep telling me he's unavailable." Another pause waited with the particular discomfort of a proud woman asking for something. "I'm not well, Eleanor. My back has been troubling me, and the specialist wants to run additional tests, and Vivian, I said again quietly. She stopped. I remember, I said, that you called me a maid with a better apron. You said it to your neighbor over the garden fence while I was 4 feet away weeding the flower bed. I remember it specifically because I had spent 3 hours that morning cooking a meal you described at dinner as adequate. The silence on her end was total. I also remember. I continued in the same measured tone, the herbal tea blend you gave me in the 3rd month of my marriage. You said it would help me sleep. You said I always looked exhausted. A sound on the line, not quite a word, not quite a breath. I drank it every morning for 4 years, I said. Thank you for that recommendation, Vivian. The line was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed again, lower, careful, the voice of a woman who had just understood that the conversation she thought she was having was not the conversation that was actually taking place. Eleanor, Richard's financial situation is his own to manage, I said. I am no longer in a position to assist with that. I hope your back improves. I ended the call. I did not block the number. I stood at my office window with the cream-colored phone in my hand and looked at the city below where the evening lights were coming on, one by one, the way they always did, indifferent and precise. I would need that number again. Not for her sake. For the record, Daniel Mercer requested a second meeting on a Friday morning 3 weeks before the closing ceremony. This time, he did not go through the SEC field office. He contacted Patricia directly through the same blind channel he had used the first time and asked for a private room and 2 hours. Patricia called me immediately. He says he has the final piece, she said. Where? He suggested the Fairmont, a conference room off the lobby, neutral, private, not associated with either party. Book it, I said. I'll be there. Patricia paused. Eleanor, we agreed you wouldn't be directly present until... Book it, Patricia. She booked it. Mercer was already seated when we arrived, a compact, careful man in his early 50s, with the look of someone who had been carrying a significant weight for a long time and had recently decided to set it down, not because it had become lighter, but because he had accepted that carrying it further served no purpose he could justify. He looked at me for a moment when I walked in. Then he said simply, I wondered if it would be you. Did you know before today? I asked. I suspected. The blind trust structure, the way the Meridian deal was insulated, it had the architecture of someone who knew exactly what they were protecting. He folded his hands on the table. I'm sorry for what happened in that house. I didn't know about the other matter until Patricia told me last week. He meant the poisoning. I nodded once and sat down. Tell me what you have, I said. He opened a folder and placed an audit trail on the table, 12 pages annotated in his own hand, tracing the complete history of the $60 million bank loan from application to disbursement to final destination. The audited financials, he said, turning to page 4, were prepared by Merritt and Associates. I've documented here that Richard holds 40% of that firm through a nominee, his college roommate, Thomas Breck, who has no accounting license and no professional credentials of any kind. He looked up. Richard signed the loan application certifying the financials as independently audited. That is bank fraud and securities fraud simultaneously. We have this, Patricia said. You have the structure. I have the confirmation. Mercer turned to the final page. 3 days before Richard placed the Vantage Biotech options trade, he received a call at the family home. I have the phone records. The caller was a board member of Vantage, a man named Harrison Cole, who has since resigned his position. The call lasted 22 minutes. He slid the phone records across the table. Richard took that call. Mercer said, in the kitchen. His notes from the following morning reference a conversation about Q3 regulatory approval timing. A pause. Information that was not public for another 11 days. I looked at the phone records. The call had been placed to the Lincoln Park House landline at 7:18 on a Tuesday evening. I had been in that kitchen at 7:18 on Tuesday evenings for years. He took the call while I was cooking dinner. I said, Yes, Mercer said quietly. I believe he did. The room was very still. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," I said. "Your cooperation will be noted in every proceeding that follows." He nodded and began gathering his documents. The net, I thought, was now complete. I cooked on a Sunday evening for the first time since leaving the Lincoln Park house. Not because I needed to. My penthouse, on the 44th floor of a building 3 blocks from the office, had a kitchen that had been largely decorative for the past 2 months. I had been eating at my desk or in restaurants the way I had eaten during the decades before Richard, when time was the only currency I monitored more carefully than money. I cooked because I wanted to make the soup, the butternut squash bisque, the one that had been reducing on the stove when Richard walked through the front door with Cassandra and an overnight bag and a sealed envelope that offered me $40,000 for 8 years of my life. I bought the ingredients on Saturday morning from the Green City Market on Clark Street, the way my mother had taught me touching the squash, to feel the weight of it, smelling the thyme, before buying it, taking the time that most people no longer believed was worth taking. The vendor, a woman about my age with paint-stained hands, said, "You know what you're looking for." "I've made this before," I said. On Sunday evening, I stood at my kitchen counter and cooked without hurry. I caramelized the onions slowly. I added the cognac at the right moment. I let the squash roast until the edges were exactly the shade of amber that meant the sugars had done what they needed to do. I worked with the particular attention that cooking requires when you are doing it for yourself and no one else, when there is no performance involved, no judgment pending, no one to tell you the result is flavorless. When it was done, I ladled it into a single bowl and sat at the kitchen table. I tasted it. It was exactly as I had always intended it to be. It had always been exactly as I intended. Nobody had ever said so. Not once in 8 years of Wednesday dinners and Sunday roasts and carefully constructed meals that disappeared into the appetite of people who'd never thought to ask who made them or what it cost. I set the spoon down. I thought about the miscarriage in year 2. I thought about the specialist's careful face and his careful words. Sometimes these things have no explanation. I thought about 4 years of mornings with a cup of herbal tea, grateful for the small gesture of a woman who had been poisoning me while I thanked her for it. I thought about the research fund, $50 million, the Margaret Eleanor Hale Fund, my mother's name first, my own second, every dollar of it directed toward understanding what had been done to me and to women like me, so that the next specialist would have the information he needed to find the real answer. I picked up a notepad from the counter and wrote in my own handwriting a single sentence. "You are not the woman they thought you were. You never were." I folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket where the black phone lived. I finished the soup. It was, I thought, the best thing I had eaten in years. The 6 weeks between the board meeting and the closing ceremony were the quietest of the entire preceding year. Not because nothing was happening. Everything was happening. Patricia coordinating with Agent Briggs on evidence transfer protocols, Marcus finalizing the guest list and press credentials for the Intercontinental event, Mercer completing his formal whistleblower submission to the SEC's Chicago office, Naomi's forensic samples being transferred to the FBI's evidence custody chain with documentation that would satisfy any federal court. But from the outside, from any vantage point that was not mine, nothing appeared to be moving at all. I went to the office every morning. I chaired meetings. I approved the quarterly earnings report, which was strong. Hale Biosciences had had an excellent year. The Meridian acquisition had been received positively by the institutional investors who had been quietly briefed, and the stock had moved in the direction that rewarded patience. I ate lunch at my desk. I called my sister on Sundays. I was to all observable appearances a woman settling back into her professional life after a private disruption, composed, focused, moving forward. Meanwhile, Richard was not moving forward. Patricia's weekly surveillance reports told the story with the unembellished precision she applied to everything. The margin calls had accelerated 2 more in week 3, a third in week 5, that required the liquidation of a position Richard had held for 6 years at a loss that Mercer estimated at $1.4 million. The Bentley payment had been missed once and made late once. The penthouse rent for month 5 had been paid from a personal credit line that was now carrying a balance of $230,000 at an interest rate that would compound unkindly. And through all of it, Richard maintained his position. Meridian closes in 4 weeks. He told a former colleague over lunch per a report from Patricia's monitoring of his personal email. After that, everything resets. 3 weeks, he told Cassandra when she raised the subject of the missed Bentley payment. 3 weeks and we're clear. 2 weeks, he told his remaining senior advisor when the man came to him with concerns about the firm's cash position. 2 weeks, hold the line. I read each of these dispatches on Friday mornings with my coffee and the lake in the window, and something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a man walking with complete confidence toward a conclusion he had entirely misunderstood. Agent Briggs called me directly for the first time on a Thursday in week 5. "Ms. Hale," he said, "we're ready on our end. 7 months of parallel investigation. The evidence your team provided has been integrated and the federal dossier is complete." A pause. "We'll need confirmation of the event logistics 1 week prior." "You'll have it," I said. "One more thing," Briggs said. "Calloway has no idea." "No," I said, "he doesn't." I ended the call and looked at the lake for a long moment. 2 weeks. I had been patient for 8 years. 2 weeks was nothing at all. The invitations went out on a Monday morning, 6 days before the closing ceremony. Marcus had overseen every detail with the thoroughness he applied to anything he considered historically significant. The cardstock was heavy cream, engraved rather than printed, the kind of physical formality that signals to its recipient that what they are being invited to matters. The envelope carried the Hale Biosciences seal in the upper left corner and the Intercontinental Chicago address embossed on the back flap. 340 invitations, institutional investors, board members, regulatory officials from the FDA and the Congressional Pharmaceutical Oversight Committee, senior executives from the pharmaceutical sector, press credentials for 12 journalists, including James Whitfield of the Chicago Tribune listed under his professional designation as pharmaceutical regulation correspondent, and one envelope addressed in Marcus's careful hand to Mr. Richard J. Calloway, Managing Director, Calloway Capital Management, 330 North Wabash Avenue, Suite 2100, Chicago, Illinois 60611. I had approved the wording of his invitation personally. It read as all the others did as a formal acknowledgement of Calloway Capital's role as sell-side advisor on the Meridian Pharma transaction and a cordial request for his attendance at the closing ceremony and reception. Cordial. I had chosen that word myself. Patricia called me at 11:30 that morning. His assistant confirmed the RSVP 20 minutes ago. Richard Calloway, +1. +1, I said. Cassandra Voss is listed as his guest. I set down my pen. Good, I said. Make sure Agent Briggs has both names on the confirmed attendance list. Already done. He's placing 2 agents inside the venue as catering staff, beginning 4 hours before the event. 2 more at the east entrance. Patricia paused. Eleanor. I want to be certain you understand what the evening will look like from a procedural standpoint. The arrest, if it proceeds as planned, will happen in front of 340 guests and 12 credentialed journalists. I understand. It will be public in a way that cannot be undone. Patricia, I said quietly. He handed me a settlement agreement in my own kitchen while his girlfriend commented on the smell of my soup. His mother told me I was a maid with a better apron. He poisoned me for 4 years. I paused. I am comfortable with public. A brief silence. Understood, she said. After the call, I sat for a moment at my desk, the confirmation of Richard's RSVP in front of me, and thought about the last time I had been in the same room as him, the front door of the Lincoln Park house closing behind me, the sound of Cassandra asking about the 9:30 reservation, the bisque still warm on the stove. He would walk into the Intercontinental Grand Ballroom in 6 days, believing he was there to collect $14 million. He would leave in handcuffs. The invitation had been cordial. What followed would be precise. I know what Cassandra did on the afternoon of the closing ceremony because Patricia's surveillance extended by that point to her personal email and credit card activity, and because one of her close friends, a woman named Brooke, who worked in luxury retail on the Magnificent Mile and who would later provide a voluntary statement to the FBI, described the afternoon in considerable detail. I am narrating it here as I later assembled it, not with malice, with the precision that the full picture requires. Cassandra began preparing at 2 o'clock. The event started at 7. She had purchased the gown 3 weeks earlier, a $14,000 silk crepe in deep emerald green, bought at a boutique on Oak Street and charged to Richard's corporate card under the category professional attire. She had told Brooke over lunch the week before that she intended to make an entrance. Richard says this is the biggest deal his firm has ever touched, she had said. $14 million in fees. After tonight, everything changes. Are you nervous? Brooke had asked. About what, Cassandra had replied with the genuine puzzlement of someone to whom the question did not compute. She was not nervous. She was strategic. The closing ceremony was in her precise internal accounting, a social debut, the moment at which Cassandra Voss Calloway would step into a room full of Chicago's financial and pharmaceutical elite and be introduced not as Richard's assistant, not as his girlfriend, but as the woman beside the man who had just closed the biggest deal of the year. She had practiced the introduction in the mirror that afternoon. Cassandra Voss Calloway, Richard's partner. Then, Cassandra Voss, you may know my husband's firm, Calloway Capital. Then, deciding this was stronger, Cassandra Calloway. Richard is just over there, shall I introduce you? She settled on the third version. She did not know that 2 SEC agents had been inside the Intercontinental since 3 o'clock, moving through the venue in catering uniforms, confirming sight lines and exit routes with the methodical patience of people who had done this before. She did not know that her name appeared on a federal indictment that had been sealed and approved by a judge in the Northern District of Illinois 48 hours earlier. She did not know that the emerald gown she had spent 4 hours perfecting her appearance inside would be photographed by 12 journalists before the evening was over, not as a fashion document, but as evidence of the specific texture of a life built on other people's fraud. She looked at herself in the mirror at 6:30 and was satisfied. "We should go," Richard called from the other room. "1 minute," she said. She took the minute. She smoothed the silk. She practiced the smile, the one that was warm but not eager, confident but not aggressive. The smile of a woman who belonged in every room she entered. She had worked very hard on that smile. It would not survive the evening. 8 years of silence. 1 room, 340 witnesses. Before I walk through those doors, comment ballroom if you're ready to see what happens next. I want to know you're still standing here with me. A small reminder some moments in this story have been shaped for narrative depth and reflection. If that's not for you now, is a graceful moment to step away. But if you stay, I promise, it's worth it. I arrived at the Intercontinental at 6:55. Marcus was waiting in the lobby, standing beside Patricia, both of them in black tie, both of them with the particular stillness of people who have prepared for something a long time and are now simply present for its arrival. Marcus looked at me and said nothing for a moment. I was wearing a steel gray Armani gown, one I had purchased 8 years ago, the week before I removed myself from the Forbes list and attended a charity gala as nobody. I had never worn it publicly. I had kept it in a garment bag at the back of a closet in my office for a reason I had never articulated even to myself. I understood the reason now. "Ready?" Marcus asked. "I've been ready," I said, "for quite some time." We took the east corridor to the grand ballroom entrance. Through the doors, I could hear the specific sound of 340 people in formal wear, the layered murmur of conversation, the percussion of glassware, the low orchestral note of a room that believed it understood what kind of evening this was. Marcus pushed open the doors. He walked to the microphone at the room's center and said without preamble in the clear, carrying voice he used when he needed a room to listen, Ladies and gentlemen, Chairwoman Eleanor Hale, founder and chief executive of Hale Biosciences. The name landed the way names land when they belong to someone the room already knows. The conversation stopped. Not all at once in a wave from the entrance outward as heads turned and recognition moved through the room like a current. Board members who had stood when I entered the 42nd floor conference room 3 weeks ago. Regulatory officials who had sat across from me in Senate hearings. Pharmaceutical executives who had competed against me, partnered with me, watched me build something they had not believed was possible. And at the far end of the room near the champagne service, a man in a dark suit holding a glass he had stopped raising to his lips. Richard. I watched the recognition arrive on his face. It did not come all at once. It came in stages, the initial puzzlement of a man who sees something that does not fit his understanding of the world, followed by the recalibration, followed by something I can only describe as the specific color draining from a face that has just understood in a single moment the full dimensions of what it did not know. He set his glass down. Cassandra beside him was still smiling at someone she had been talking to. She had not yet looked toward the entrance. She had not yet heard the name. I crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom. It always was Hale. It had never been anything else. I walked toward the center of the room and did not look at Richard again until I was ready. I had taken perhaps 20 steps into the room when I heard him behind me. Eleanor. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had decided that composure was still available to him. I turned. Richard had crossed the room quickly. Too quickly, the kind of movement that announces itself to the people nearby even when the person making it believes it does not. 3 guests had already shifted their attention toward us. A woman from the FDA's Pharmaceutical Oversight Division, whom I had testified before, twice watched from 6 feet away with an expression of careful neutrality. Richard stopped 2 feet from me. He was close enough that I could see the precise moment his composure began to cost him something. "This is a joke," he said quietly. "You work in a kitchen." I chaired this acquisition from the first term sheet, I said at the same volume. "You were the sell-side advisor I chose not to replace because I wanted you in this room tonight." Something moved across his face. Not anger, something more interior than anger, the expression of a man rapidly reassembling a structure that has just revealed itself to have been built on a false foundation. "That's not possible," he said. "The buyer is a blind trust. You don't have—" "Hale Biosciences," I said. "Founded 12 years before our marriage. $6 billion in assets held in an irrevocable trust you were informed existed and chose not to investigate." I paused. "You told your attorney it was probably a few million, nothing significant." The color left his face completely. Cassandra had appeared at his shoulder. She looked between us with the rapid assessment of someone trying to determine which way a situation is moving. Her emerald gown caught the ballroom light. She said nothing. Richard found something, some last reserve of the arrogance that had carried him this far. He straightened. "You're nothing," he said, and his voice had dropped to almost nothing itself. "You have always been nothing. A woman who cooks and irons and pretends—" "Richard," I said. He stopped. "You should have Googled your wife." The FDA official had taken a step closer. 2 guests nearby had stopped their conversation entirely. Marcus from across the room met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. Richard stared at me with an expression I would spend a long time afterward trying to name accurately. It was not hatred. It was not grief. It was the expression of a man who had made a single, catastrophic miscalculation and was only now standing in a ballroom in front of 340 people, understanding its full cost. "Excuse me," I said pleasantly. I turned and walked to the podium. The podium was at the room's center, elevated on a low platform with a microphone adjusted to a height that suggested the previous speaker had been taller than me. I adjusted it without hurry. The room had not fully resettled from the exchange near the entrance. There was a particular quality of attention in the air, the heightened awareness of people who have sensed that something significant is occurring without yet understanding its shape. Conversations had resumed, but thinly the way conversations resume when the people having them are listening for something else. I tapped the microphone once. The room quieted. "Thank you all for being here this evening," I said. "The Meridian Pharma acquisition represents 3 years of careful work and a significant moment for Hale Biosciences, for the pharmaceutical sector, and for the patients whose lives our combined research pipeline will affect. I am grateful to everyone in this room who contributed to bringing it to this point." A murmur of acknowledgement, glasses raised in several corners. Before we proceed to the signing, I said, "I need to read a statement on behalf of the board." The murmur subsided. I reached into the leather portfolio Marcus had placed on the podium before my arrival and removed a single sheet of paper. It was an official joint press release issued that afternoon by the FBI's Chicago field office and the Securities and Exchange Commission, approved for public dissemination, dated and stamped with both agencies' seals. I looked at the sheet, then I looked at the room. The following is a joint statement from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission issued today regarding an active federal prosecution in the Northern District of Illinois. The room was absolutely still. The United States government hereby announces the indictment of Richard James Callaway, Managing Director of Callaway Capital Management, on 5 federal charges: tax evasion in the amount of $12 million over 6 years. Insider trading resulting in $23 million in illegal profit over 5 years. Money laundering of $47 million through shell entities over 4 years. Bank fraud involving $60 million in commercial loans obtained through fabricated financial statements. And criminal spousal poisoning administered systematically over a period of 4 years. I turned the page. Co-defendant Cassandra Marie Voss is indicted on charges of conspiracy to commit money laundering and securities fraud. I set the paper down. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Intercontinental Chicago was the most complete silence I had heard in years. 340 people holding a collective breath. The chandeliers burning overhead, the lake somewhere beyond the windows, moving with its usual indifference. I looked at Richard. He had not moved. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. "We will now proceed to the signing." They came through the east door. 2 FBI agents and 2 SEC investigators, moving with the unhurried precision of people who have planned an approach many times and are now simply executing it. They wore dark suits indistinguishable from the guests around them until you noticed the way they moved, purposeful, coordinated, each one already positioned relative to the others in a pattern that left no gap. The room understood before anyone spoke. The murmur that had begun to rebuild after my reading collapsed again into silence. And in that silence, the 4 agents crossed the ballroom floor toward Richard with a directness that made the distance between the east door and where he stood feel very short. Agent Briggs reached him first. "Mr. Callaway." His voice was conversational, almost gentle, the tone of someone who has learned that calm produces better outcomes than theater. "I'm Special Agent Howard Briggs, FBI Chicago. I need you to come with me." Richard looked at him. Then he looked at me. The expression on his face was the one I had been trying to name since he crossed the room 20 minutes earlier, and standing here watching it in its fullest form, I finally understood what it was. It was disbelief. Pure, unqualified disbelief. Not the disbelief of a man who has been wrongly accused, but the disbelief of a man who had constructed an entire architecture of assumptions about the world, about what certain people were capable of, about what certain women were worth, and was now watching that architecture come down with the speed and completeness of something that had never been structurally sound. "This is," he began. "Mr. Callaway," Briggs said again quietly. "Please." Richard did not run. I had not expected him to. He was at his core, a man who believed in the power of appearances, and running through a ballroom in front of 340 witnesses was an appearance he could not manage. He went with them. Across the room, Cassandra had backed against the wall near the champagne service, both hands at her sides, the emerald gown catching the chandelier light with a precision the evening had not intended. A female SEC investigator approached her and spoke quietly into her ear. Cassandra's face crumpled. Not gradually, but all at once, the way a constructed thing collapses when the central support is removed. She began to cry. I need to call. You'll have the opportunity to make a call, the investigator said. Please come with me. Near the press area, I heard the sound of camera shutters, rapid, continuous. Whitfield was already moving notebook in hand, credentials, visible his photographer beside him, capturing the emerald gown and the east door and the space where Richard Calloway had been standing. The room exhaled. Marcus appeared at my shoulder. Eleanor. I know, I said. Are you all right? I looked at the east door, now closed. Yes, I said. Let's sign the papers. I was not in Evanston that night. What I know of Vivian's evening came later through the account of her neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, who provided a voluntary statement to Patricia's team. The 11 o'clock news led with it. I know this because Patricia, who had remained at the Intercontinental until the last federal agent departed, and the last journalist had been escorted to the press room, sent me a transcript at 11:47 with a single line of her own. Appended at the bottom, Channel 7 ran 4 minutes, CBS ran 6, it's everywhere. Vivian Calloway watched the news from her house in Evanston in a wingback chair beside the fireplace, the chair Richard had bought her 3 Christmases ago, the one she had described to a neighbor as the only thoughtful thing that boy has ever chosen without being told. The anchor's voice, Chicago financier. Richard Calloway was arrested tonight at the Intercontinental Hotel during a pharmaceutical acquisition ceremony on federal charges, including tax evasion, insider trading, money laundering, and bank fraud totaling $142 million. Also charged is financial analyst Cassandra Voss. The arrest was made at an event hosted by Hale Biosciences chairwoman Eleanor Hale, who is identified in federal documents as Calloway's former spouse. The screen showed the ballroom. It showed Eleanor Hale at the podium in a steel gray gown, reading from a single sheet of paper, with the composure of someone who had been preparing for that moment for a very long time. Mrs. Paulson said that when she knocked and Vivian opened the door, Vivian was holding her phone with both hands and had the look of a woman who had just watched the floor of a room she believed to be solid reveal itself as something else entirely. "Are you all right, Vivian?" Mrs. Paulson had asked. Vivian had not answered. She had looked at Mrs. Paulson and then back at the television where the anchor was now explaining the spousal poisoning charge and said very quietly, "I didn't think she was anyone." Mrs. Paulson did not know what to make of that. She made tea and stayed for an hour. The following morning, Vivian's attorney called her at 8:15 to inform her that her accounts had been frozen by federal order, the portion traceable to Richard's laundered funds, subject to immediate forfeiture. Her legitimate accounts remained technically accessible, but where the attorney explained with the careful language of a man delivering news, he found professionally uncomfortable, insufficient to cover the retainer required for her criminal defense. Aggravated battery conspiracy. Class 2 felony. The attorney's retainer, $80,000. Vivian's unfrozen balance, $31,000. She reached for her phone and called Eleanor's number. Eleanor did not answer. The signing happened the following morning at 9 o'clock. Not in the grand ballroom. That room had been released back to the hotel at midnight. The federal agents gone. The press credentials revoked, the chandeliers burning over empty tables and half-finished glasses of champagne that nobody had returned to collect. The closing itself took place in a private conference room on the 38th floor of the Michigan Avenue Tower. 7 people present, myself. Marcus, Patricia. 2 Meridian Pharma Board representatives, their outside counsel, and a notary. It took 11 minutes. I signed my name 4 times on documents that had been prepared, reviewed, and approved over the preceding 3 months with the precision that a transaction of this magnitude requires. $3.1 billion, transferring Meridian Pharma's assets, pipeline, and intellectual property to Hale Biosciences through the blind trust vehicle that had kept the buyer's identity concealed from the sell-side advisor until the moment it no longer needed to be concealed. The sell-side advisory fee, $14 million, was wired to Callaway Capital Management's escrow account at 10:17 that morning per the contractual obligation Hale Biosciences had agreed to honor regardless of the circumstances of the previous evening. Patricia had raised this point 3 weeks earlier. "We are still obligated to pay the fee," she had said. "The arrest does not void the advisory agreement." "I know," I had said. "Pay it." "Eleanor." "Pay it, Patricia. I want Richard to know wherever he is sitting when he finds out that the money arrived, that it was real, that it was everything he had been counting on." I had paused. "And then I want him to find out what happened to it." What happened to it was this: at 10:19, 2 minutes after the wire cleared, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit executed a seizure order on Callaway Capital Management's escrow account, freezing all funds as proceeds of an ongoing federal fraud investigation. $14 million arrived, frozen, unreachable. The money Richard had built his entire exit strategy around the fee that was going to reset everything, that was going to cover the margin calls and the penthouse and the Bentley payment and Vivian's allowance and Cassandra's patience, sat in an account he would never access, earning interest for the federal government. Marcus, when Patricia informed him of the seizure confirmation, said nothing for a moment. Then, "That is extraordinarily precise." "Yes," I said. I looked at the signed documents on the conference room table. $3.1 billion, 11 minutes, 4 signatures. The Meridian acquisition, the deal Richard had celebrated over roast chicken while I served his dinner and said nothing was complete. It had always been mine to complete. I gathered my portfolio, thanked the Meridian representatives, and took the elevator down to the lobby. Outside Chicago was bright and cold and entirely indifferent to everything that had just concluded inside its buildings. I walked 2 blocks to the office and went to work. The story ran on the front page of the Chicago Tribune the morning after the signing. James Whitfield's byline above the fold in the typeface the Tribune reserved for stories it considered historically significant. The headline: "Pharma chairwoman exposes husband's $142 million fraud scheme at own acquisition ceremony." Below it, a photograph: the grand ballroom, the podium, a woman in a steel gray gown reading from a single sheet of paper with the composure of someone who had been preparing for that moment for a very long time. The photograph had been taken by the Tribune's photographer from the press area at the precise moment I had set the paper down and looked at the room. I looked in the photograph like someone who had already decided how the evening would end. I had. Patricia sent me the digital edition at 6:15 with a message: "AP picked it up at 4 a.m., Wall Street Journal, running a follow piece this afternoon. Bloomberg has 3 analysts covering the Hale Biosciences stock movement, up 7% at open." I read the message, set my phone face down on the desk, and returned to what I had been doing when it arrived. The first tranche of the Margaret Eleanor Hale Fund's endowment had cleared the previous afternoon, $25 million transferred to the fund's dedicated research account at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. The remaining $25 million was scheduled for the University of Chicago's Pritzker School of Medicine, contingent on the completion of their reproductive health research proposal, which their department chair had submitted the previous week, and which I had been reviewing since 6 o'clock that morning. It was of all the documents I had read in the preceding months, the one I read most carefully. The proposal outlined a 5-year research program into the detection and long-term effects of synthetic hormone-blocking compounds administered without consent, a category of harm that existing medical literature had not yet formally defined as a distinct clinical pattern. The research team proposed developing both a diagnostic protocol and a treatment framework. They estimated the program would generate findings affecting the care of an estimated 40,000 women annually. I approved the proposal at 8:47 and sent the authorization to the fund's administrator with a single instruction: begin immediately. Marcus knocked on my open office door at 9. "Have you read the Tribune?" he asked. "I've seen the headline," I said. "Whitfield is going to win a Pulitzer." "I know." Marcus looked at me for a moment with the expression he wore when he wanted to say something and was deciding whether it was necessary. He decided it was not necessary. He turned to go. "Marcus," I said. He stopped. "Thank you," I said, "for everything, for 11 years of everything." He was quiet for a moment. "It was never a hardship," he said. He closed the door softly behind him. I turned back to the research proposal and kept working. Cassandra was released on $500,000 bail at 2:15 the afternoon after her arrest. The bond had been posted by her mother, a retired schoolteacher in Naperville, who'd driven to the federal courthouse on South Dearborn in a 12-year-old Honda Civic and signed the paperwork with the expression of a woman performing an act of love she did not fully understand and could not afford. I know this because Whitfield told me 3 weeks later when I finally agreed to speak with him on the record. He had been thorough, as he always was. Cassandra's public statement was delivered on the courthouse steps at 3 o'clock to a cluster of journalists who had been waiting in the November cold with the patience of people accustomed to waiting. She was wearing a gray coat, not the emerald gown which had been photographed sufficiently, and the specific expression of someone who has spent the preceding 18 hours constructing a version of events they find livable. "I was in love with him," she said to the microphones. "I didn't know about any of this. I trusted him completely." A journalist asked about the LLC registration documents bearing her signature. "I signed what he told me to sign," she said. "I didn't ask questions. I should have. I understand that now." Whitfield called me that afternoon and read me the statement. "Your response?" he asked. I thought about Cassandra in the structuring meeting, asking specific questions about transfer mechanics. I thought about her email to Richard I've been patient sent while his margin calls accumulated and his personal accounts drained. I thought about Mercer's testimony, precise and documented, placing her at the center of decisions she had not been handed but had made. "She signed the LLC registration documents," I said. "People sign what they intend." Whitfield wrote it down. It ran in his follow piece the next morning, attributed to me by name, the first time I had been quoted directly in connection with the case. 6 weeks later, Cassandra's attorney negotiated a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office. The terms full cooperation and testimony against Richard in exchange for a reduced charge of 1 count of conspiracy with a sentencing recommendation of 18 months and supervised release. She agreed within 24 hours of the offer being made. It was, I reflected when Patricia informed me, the most Cassandra decision she could have made, transactional, self-preserving, arrived at without apparent anguish. She had looked at the situation, calculated the optimal outcome available to her, and moved toward it without sentiment. In another life applied to different ends, it might have been a useful quality. "She'll testify against Richard," Patricia said. "Good," I said. "Make sure the prosecutor knows she has full cooperation from our side as well." I returned to the research proposal on my desk. Cassandra Voss had made her last calculation. It was like most of her calculations correct in its arithmetic and entirely empty at its center. The trial lasted 19 days. I attended none of it. This was a deliberate decision made in consultation with Patricia and Agent Briggs, and also a personal one. I had built the case. I had assembled the evidence. I had stood at a podium in a steel gray gown and read 5 federal charges into a microphone in front of 340 people. What happened in a courtroom 17 months later was the law's work, not mine, and I had learned long ago the discipline of completing your part of a thing and then stepping back to let the rest of it proceed without you. I was in Geneva when the verdict came. The Margaret Eleanor Hale Fund's first international research grants were being presented at the World Health Organization's Reproductive Health Symposium, a ceremony I had agreed to attend 8 months earlier before the trial date had been confirmed, and which I chose not to reschedule when the dates overlapped. Patricia had suggested I might want to be in Chicago for the verdict. I had told her I would be in Geneva for the grants. She had not argued. She understood. The call came from Patricia at 2:17 in the afternoon Geneva time. I stepped out of the symposium hall into a corridor overlooking Lake Geneva, a different lake. Smaller stiller, the Alps visible on the far shore in the clear November air. "Guilty," Patricia said. "All 5 counts." I stood at the window and looked at the lake. "Sentencing," I asked. Judge Reinhold issued from the bench. 14 years federal with the financial fraud counts running concurrently. A pause. The spousal poisoning charge, she added 18 months consecutively. She said in her statement that it constituted a calculated and sustained assault on a partner's bodily autonomy and warranted distinct punishment. 14 years, plus 18 months. Richard James Calloway, who had handed me a settlement agreement for $40,000 and told me I had brought nothing remarkable to a room, would be 69 years old when he was released. And Cassandra, I asked. Sentenced last week per the plea. 18 months minimum security supervised release. She's already negotiating a media interview. And Vivian, I asked. No contest plea, Patricia said. 3 years probation, the court considered her age and documented health condition. She will not serve prison time. I said nothing. The law had decided. That was sufficient. Of course she is, I said. Eleanor. Patricia's voice shifted slightly, the careful shift she made when she was moving from professional to something adjacent to personal. How are you? I looked at the Alps across the water. Snow on the upper elevations, the lower slopes still green, the lake between them holding the light of a late afternoon in November, with a stillness that seemed at this distance absolute. I am, I said slowly, exactly where I chose to be. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That seems right, she said. I thanked her and ended the call. Inside the symposium hall, a researcher from Northwestern was presenting the first findings from the diagnostic protocol the Margaret Eleanor Hale Fund had commissioned. Early results, preliminary data, the beginning of something that would take years to complete. I put my phone away and went back inside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 8 months after the arrest. It was handwritten, not typed, not emailed, not delivered through an attorney's office. Handwritten on cream notepaper in the careful cursive of a woman who had been taught that penmanship was a reflection of character and had maintained the habit long after most people had abandoned it. The return address was a street in Waukegan I did not recognize. I looked it up. A residential block of modest rental apartments 28 miles north of Chicago, the kind of neighborhood that exists at the precise distance from the city, where the cost of living becomes manageable and everything else becomes a compromise. My personal assistant brought it to me with the morning correspondence. She did not know who it was from. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. I opened it at my desk alone before the day's first meeting. Eleanor, I have written this letter 4 times and thrown away 3 versions because I kept trying to explain myself. An explanation is not what I owe you. What I owe you is the truth, which is this: I was wrong about you. I was wrong from the beginning, and I continued being wrong for 8 years because it was easier than being right. I do not ask you to forgive me. I am 78 years old, and I understand finally what forgiveness costs the person who gives it, and I will not ask you to pay that for my benefit. I ask only that you understand that I was afraid. Richard was all I had after his father died. I was afraid of losing him to a woman I did not choose, and fear made me into something I would prefer not to have been. That is not an excuse. It is simply the truth. Vivian Calloway. I read it twice. Then I set it on the desk and sat with it for a long moment, the way you sit with something that is simultaneously less than you expected and more than you were prepared for. She had not asked for money. She had not asked for intervention. She had asked in the careful language of a proud woman, stripped of everything that pride had rested on, only to be understood. I did not call her. I did not write back. I called my personal assistant and gave her a single instruction: arrange an anonymous monthly wire transfer of $1,200 to the Waukegan address on the envelope. Recurring indefinite source untraceable to me. $1,200. Enough for utilities. Enough for groceries. Enough to keep a 78-year-old woman warm in a rental apartment in Waukegan through a Chicago winter. Not enough to restore what she had lost. Not nothing. My assistant wrote it down without asking why. When she left, I looked at the letter one more time. I did not forgive her. I said to no one in the quiet of my office. I simply decided she would not die of cold on my conscience. I folded the letter, placed it in the desk drawer beside the note I had written to myself in my penthouse kitchen, and went to my first meeting of the day. The Lincoln Park house went to auction on a Friday in March. I had known the date for 6 weeks. Patricia had flagged it in her weekly summary with a brief note: asset forfeiture auction scheduled. Do you wish to attend the pre-sale walkthrough? I had read the note, set it aside, and returned to it 3 days later with an answer I had not expected to give. Yes, I told her. Arrange it. The walkthrough was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at 10. I went alone. No Marcus, no Patricia, no assistant. I told no one except the real estate attorney coordinating the federal asset disposition, a careful young man named Mr. Aldridge, who met me at the front door with a clipboard and the professional composure of someone determined not to acknowledge that the situation was unusual. The property will go to auction Friday, he said, unlocking the door. You're welcome to move through at your own pace. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything. He said kitchen without apparent awareness of what the word contained. I moved through the house slowly. The dark wood, the high ceilings, the proportions that announced a certain kind of success. Vivian's furniture still in place, the federal asset team had inventoried and tagged everything but removed nothing yet. The sitting room where she had watched her morning programs at full volume. The dining room where she had hosted Wednesday dinners and called my soup flavorless while Richard chuckled and patted her hand. I walked through each room with the specific attention of someone saying goodbye to something they never fully owned. Then I walked to the kitchen. It was exactly as I had left it on a Tuesday evening 7 months ago. The same counters, the same windowsill where the herb garden had been. The herbs were gone now, dried and brittle in their pots, nobody having thought to water them. The same table, the same chairs. On the back of the chair nearest the stove, folded with a neatness that had survived 7 months of an empty house, was my apron. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a long moment. Then I walked to the chair, picked it up, and folded it again precisely the way I folded everything, corners aligned, edges straight. I held it for a moment. Cotton faded blue, a small stain near the hem from a Tuesday evening when the bisque had reduced too quickly and splashed. I put it in my bag. Mr. Aldridge appeared in the doorway. All finished. Yes, I said, thank you. He held the front door open as I left. The March air was cold and bright, the kind of Chicago morning that offers no sentiment, only weather. I walked to my car. It was a good apron, I said to no one, unlocking the door. I had no reason to leave it behind. I drove back to the office without stopping. The note had been in the inside pocket of my jacket for 4 months. I had moved it from jacket to jacket the way some people carry a photograph or a coin, not consciously reaching for it, but aware at some peripheral level that it was there. A small folded square of notepaper that I had written alone in my penthouse kitchen on a Sunday evening after finishing a bowl of butternut squash bisque that no one had told me was good. I read it on a Thursday evening in April at my desk after the last meeting of the day had ended and the office had emptied and the city outside the window was doing what Chicago does in April, changing its mind about spring every 40 minutes, the lake gray, and then silver, and then gray again. I unfolded it. You are not the woman they thought you were. You never were. I sat with it for a long time. I thought about the woman who had written it standing at a kitchen counter in a penthouse she had moved into 3 weeks after signing a settlement agreement for $40,000 alone on a Sunday evening, cooking the same soup she had been making when her life as she had constructed it came apart. Writing a sentence to herself, the way you write a sentence when you need to say something true, and there is no one in the room to say it to. I thought about the woman before that waking at 5:45 to iron a shirt for a man who had never once commented on the eggs, sliding a black phone back into her robe pocket and approving a $340 million acquisition before the coffee finished brewing. Sitting in a guest bathroom alone at 9:15, approving a board resolution on a phone she kept hidden while the man who shared her name slept in the room she was no longer welcome in. I thought about the miscarriage, the specialist's careful face. Sometimes these things have no explanation. I thought about the research fund, $50 million, Northwestern and Chicago and Geneva, and the researchers who were already 4 months in beginning to find the explanations that had been missing. I thought about the note Vivian had written. I was afraid of losing him folded in the same desk drawer as this one. 2 pieces of paper, nothing alike, both true in their own diminished way. I folded my note back along its original creases and held it for a moment. The best revenge, I said quietly to the empty office to the lake to no one, is not living well. I set the note on the desk. The best revenge is simply continuing. I put the note in the desk drawer beside Vivian's letter and a photograph of my mother I kept there and rarely looked at and never removed. I turned off the desk lamp. Outside Chicago was still changing its mind about spring. I put on my coat and went home. I was at my desk at 6 o'clock on a Thursday morning in May. The city was just turning light, that specific Chicago light that arrives in May, with the particular quality of something that has been away for a long time and returns without apology, filling the lake and the glass towers and the streets below with a brightness that is almost argumentative in its insistence that winter is finished and the matter is settled. My assistant had left coffee on the corner of the desk before I arrived. She always did. I'd never asked her to. It was simply something she had begun doing in the first weeks after I returned to the office, and it had become, without discussion, part of the architecture of our mornings. Small things become architecture when they are repeated with care. I had learned that in a kitchen once, and I had not forgotten it. I drank the coffee and looked at the desk. The day's briefings printed and stacked in the order Marcus had established 11 years ago. Board items first, regulatory second, acquisitions, third, everything else in descending priority. The research fund's second quarter grant report flagged with a green tab by my assistant, who had learned which documents I read before the others. A message from Marcus, handwritten on his customary note card board, approves Geneva expansion, unanimous. Congratulations. I set the note card aside and picked up the grant report. 47 research programs currently funded across 11 institutions. Preliminary findings from Northwestern's diagnostic protocol showing statistically significant detection rates for synthetic hormone-blocking compounds in stored blood samples previously classified as unexplained fertility cases. Early data, the beginning of something that would take years to become what it needed to be. 40,000 women annually, the proposal had estimated. I thought about that number the way I thought about all large numbers, not abstractly, but as an accumulation of individual instances. 40,000 mornings, 40,000 specialists saying sometimes these things have no explanation. 40,000 women who deserved the explanation and had not received it, not because the explanation did not exist, but because no one had yet thought to look for it properly. We were looking now. On the desk beside the grant report sat one unopened notification from a financial newswire, something about a pharmaceutical sector development flagged by the overnight monitoring system. I looked at it. I did not open it yet. I finished my coffee first. Outside, the lake was visible from here, on clear mornings a strip of blue between the buildings, and this morning it was very clear. The water was the color that water is in May in Chicago. Something between silver and blue, the color of a city that has survived another winter and is not surprised by it, but is perhaps quietly pleased with itself for having done so again. I set down the cup. I thought about a kitchen at 6 a.m. 8 years ago, a hidden phone beneath the counter edge, a stock alert for $3.1 billion approved between the eggs and the newspaper, a woman who had chosen for reasons she understood completely to be invisible, who had wanted just once to be loved for something other than what she owned, and had paid for that wanting in ways she could not have calculated at the time. I thought about what invisible had cost: the mornings, the Wednesday dinners, the herbal tea, the specialist's careful face, the settlement agreement on the kitchen counter, $40,000 for 8 years, offered by a man who had decided she was not worth investigating. He had been wrong by $6 billion and one life entirely. I thought about the apron folded in the drawer of my credenza, washed now pressed, kept not as a reminder of what had been done to me, but as a record of who I had been through it. A woman who cooked well and said nothing, and waited and built and survived. I picked up the financial news notification and opened it. I read it. A competitor's pipeline acquisition tangentially relevant to two of our research partnerships. Nothing urgent. I made a note for Marcus and set it aside. I picked up the next document and kept working. The city outside continued its May morning. The lake held its light. Somewhere across Chicago in a federal correctional facility, a man who had once handed me a pen and told me I had 10 minutes was beginning another day of 14 years. Somewhere in Waukegan, a 78-year-old woman was receiving, without knowing its source, enough money to keep the heat on. Somewhere in 11 research institutions, 47 programs were running looking for explanations that 40,000 women deserved. And here at a desk on the 38th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, a woman who had once been invisible was simply continuing. They had thought I was nobody. They were right about one thing. I was nobody's. 8 years. That is how long I made myself invisible for a man who never deserved the view. I thought I was protecting love. I was protecting an illusion. And God, in His quiet way, has never allowed illusions to stand forever, not even the ones we build ourselves. So if you are reading this from inside a life that no longer fits you, if you are folding someone else's apron, swallowing someone else's cruelty, waiting for someone to finally see you, don't do what I did. Don't confuse loyalty with surrender. Don't let someone's refusal to recognize your value become your own belief. You were somebody before they arrived. You will be somebody long after they are gone. I am 56 years old. I built a $6 billion company. I spent 8 years being called nobody in my own kitchen. Both are true. Only one defines me. The rest, the ballroom, the handcuffs, the 14 years, the apron I took back, that was simply the truth arriving on its own schedule. It always does. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs it today. Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. The next story is already waiting for you. A gentle warning: some stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to illuminate deeper truths. If that's not for you, no judgment, choose what serves you. But if you stay, I'll make it worth your while. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That means everything.